Welcome, of course, to the Elliott School. My name is Alyssa Ayers, and I'm dean here. We're here today to celebrate the launch of The One State Reality, What is Israel-Palestine, a volume that is just out in March from Cornell University Press. This volume represents a tremendous collaborative effort by leading scholars of Middle East politics, scholars who are grappling with an issue that has occupied the Middle East and, of course, the world for nearly a century. We're speaking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and specifically the possibilities for a peaceful resolution. Feels especially relevant right now, given the headlines. The volume we're here to discuss today, The One State Reality, What is Israel-Palestine, argues that a one-state reality already predominates in the territories controlled by the State of Israel. As the editors put it in their introduction, they offer a perspective that differs from views that describe where matters were coming from or going to, and now treat the present implicitly as an interlude. So the volume tries to move past the idea of the two-state solution to imagine alternatives that borrow from other political contexts, and they ask readers to rethink foundational concepts such as the state, sovereignty, and the nation. Spread across 4 parts and 14 total chapters, the volume illustrates, in fact, how faculty conversations can lead to meaningful scholarship. 3 of the volume co-editors are Elliott School faculty, and in fact, discussions that they had here and around the school about the disconnect between the academic and policy worlds and the question of the peace process led to eventually a conference that was convened by the Project on Middle East Political Science, or POMEPS, which is one of our Elliott School landmark initiatives, one supported generously by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, for which we are very grateful. The day-long conference that took place in fall of 2019 eventually led to the publication that we're launching today. This brings me to our esteemed panelists, the 4 co-editors of this thought-provoking volume, Professors Michael Barnett, Nathan Brown, Mark Lynch, and Shibley Telhami. I will briefly introduce each in turn. They will discuss the volume and its findings, and then Professor Lynch will moderate a Q&A with our in-person and our online participants. So Michael Barnett, down at the far end, is University Professor of International Affairs and Political Science at the Elliott School of International Affairs here at George Washington University. His work focuses on the Middle East, humanitarianism, and global governance. He's authored many books, including Eyewitness to a Genocide, United Nations in Rwanda, and Dialogues in Arab Politics. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the recipient of many awards for his research. Nathan Brown, to his right, is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University here at the Elliott School. He has previously also served as president of the Middle East Studies Association and was a Guggenheim Fellow. His work focuses on Middle Eastern politics, authoritarianism, and religion and politics. Dr. Brown currently serves on the Board of Trustees at the American University in Cairo. He has also authored many books, including Arguing Islam After the Revival of Arab Politics. Professor Mark Lynch, in the middle and to Professor Brown's immediate right, is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs, also at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He also serves as director of the Project on Middle East Political Science, which incubated and gave rise to the volume that we're launching today. He is a contributing editor of the Columbia University Press series, Columbia Studies on Middle East Politics, and his work focuses on Middle East politics, Arab media and public opinion, and public diplomacy. He's published many books, including The New Arab Wars, Uprisings, and Anarchy in the Middle East. And as I mentioned, Professor Lynch will also be acting as today's moderator. And finally, to my immediate left and to everyone else's right, Professor Shibley Telhami is Anwar Sadat, Professor for Peace and Development in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, College Park, where he is also director of the University of Maryland Critical Issues Poll. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution as well. He is the author, co-author, or editor of numerous books, including his best-selling The Stakes, America and the Middle East, which was selected by Foreign Affairs as one of the top 5 books on the Middle East in 2003. The World Through Arab Eyes, published in 2013, and the forthcoming Peace Derailed, Obama, Trump, Biden, and the Decline of Diplomacy on Israel-Palestine, 2011 to 2022. So we have a lot to hear from today. I will now turn things over to Professor Lynch.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me online if I'm speaking here? Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure and delight to be able to be here at the LE School to talk about this book that we've been working on for so long. Thank you, Dean Ayers, for that great introduction, which took away everything I was planning to say. So that can let us get more quickly to the actual substance. I would just say that this volume is the result of a collaborative work, which has been over the course of 4 years, has involved several dozen participants, including many who were not in the ultimately published volume. But this has been a work which has been obviously consuming both policy people, but also the academic community for quite some time, trying to understand what is Israel-Palestine when we let go of the illusion that ultimately it will become two states. And I think that within the wide and diverse range of contributors, Israeli, Palestinian, Western, people coming from a wide range of different perspectives, there's certainly disagreements about the policy implications of this. There are certainly disagreements about the normative stance one should take to a one-state reality. But one thing which emerged from our deliberations and our conversations was this consensus on the reality of what we were observing on the ground. I believe that at the time we began these conversations, many of us believed we were somewhere out on the avant-garde, trying to plow new ground. Thanks to the current Prime Minister of Israel's new government and coalition, I feel we're now somewhat behind the curve, but that's academic publishing for you. It's been fascinating to see how the public discourse and both academic and policy debate has changed so quickly in such a short time after many, many decades of paralysis. So what we're going to do is we're going to have each of the editors of the book speak for 7 to 10 minutes about their own perspectives on this, what brought them to the table, and what they think the major takeaways are. I'll offer much shorter comments at the end, depending on anything I feel they left out, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion from this what looks like a fabulous group in the audience. I'm sure there'll be a lot to discuss. So first, let me turn it over to the Anwar Sadat Professor of Peace and Security, my dissertation advisor, Shibley Telhami.
Thank you so much. It's really, it's been a pleasure, I have to say. You know, this is obviously a subject that matters to a lot of people, and it's clearly timely, one that we had to grapple with. But if I had to grapple with it in partnership with other people, I could not have chosen better partners. The three co-editors are people that I've worked with over, for many, many years, collaborated with. And this has been kind of a journey anyway. It's an intellectual journey, and partly it's an emotional journey because we care about what's taking place there. So it was both. It was not something that we came to very lightly. We took it seriously intellectually. That's why we also had so many people involved in this project over a period of a number of years, many extraordinary authors and contributors to this volume. In fact, it's not just the four of us who actually contributed, not only edited, but contributed substantive chapters. And I think the thing that was striking to me is all four of us are coming at it not necessarily from the same point of view, but we were all for two-state solution. We probably advocated it before it was popular in the American discourse. And we still would not oppose it if it were to be offered tomorrow. So in fact, our conclusion that we now have as a one-state reality is not a happy conclusion, and it's not a solution because it's a problematic outcome. So we don't know what the solution will ultimately be, and we need to make that clear. So it's not that we're saying, oh, we were opposing a two-state solution, or we're for a one-state solution. That is not our position. Our position is, if you analyze the reality as it now exists, has existed for some time, it is an entrenched one-state reality. And the fact is that the discourse that we've had, including in the academic world, but certainly in the policy world, has been so detached from that reality. And in many ways, it has become a smokescreen that really camouflaged that reality as we now understand it. And that's where we're coming at it, to the point that, you know, the idea of a promise of a two-state, which has become almost a religious doctrine among our policymakers. We're going to wait, we're going to preserve the status quo for the two-state solution. This is going to jeopardize the two-state solution. In a way, actually, it replaced even ideas of international law. We used to say, well, settlements violate international law. It's become, no, you know, things that have been historically violations of what we understood to be international law became things that threaten, quote, the two-state solution, and everything that threatens the two-state solution, which was not on the horizon. And of course, we all know that the occupation has lasted most of a century. I mean, most of a century is really a lifetime for the people who live there with no end in sight. So whatever you can, I was actually at a session with a former Israeli prime minister. I wouldn't mention his name because it's not for attribution recently. And he said, oh, there's only the two-state solution will ever work, but we might have to wait 50 years. And so, okay, you might have to wait 50 years, and obviously a lot could happen in 50 years, but tell that to a Palestinian, obviously in the West Bank and Gaza, you might have to wait for 50 years. But that's the reality that we're coming up against. The problem for us was, how do we conceptualize this reality using our tools in political science? How do we really describe it if it's not a state of Israel, an occupation, or it's not two entities, an autonomous Palestinian entity with Israel? That was what we grappled with. And we have done that in part through a differentiation between a state and sovereignty. That is, describing what a state is, meaning it's all about control, control of borders, control of territory, versus sovereignty, which is the international recognition of that control. Once you divide the two and understand that the two are not one and the same, because Israel does not have recognized sovereignty over these territories, then it opens up a whole new space for thinking about what it exists. And once you reach the conclusion that it's one state, then everything starts looking differently. And if you begin by observing the incredible demonstrations in Israel recently, I mean, I have never seen anything like that. I'm an Israel watcher. It's just amazing. You know, hundreds of thousands of people for 14 consecutive weeks getting out there in ways that we have never. You know, an Israeli spring on a scale, you know, that just unparalleled in the history of Israel. And it was they're calling for preserving democracy, and of course they are looking at it through the prism of the pre-1967 Israel, democracy within pre-1967 Israel, and pretending like the millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are not really part of that game. But if you're looking at it through a one-state reality, it looks completely different. And therefore, then you have to ask that question, if that's the starting point, you have to then say, what kind of state, if it is a one state? And that takes us into a different kind of space, thinking about, is it an apartheid state? And my colleague will address that, but that's an issue that we had to grapple with. And if it is a state like an apartheid state, what does that mean for American foreign policy? What does that mean for the international community? Those are the kind of questions we did not fully address in the book. In the book, we basically have we have invited people, contributors who wrote on the policy section, not so much to see what they recommend or what we recommend as a group, but to kind of think out how the US might react to a one-state reality, how Europe might react to one-state reality, rather than putting our own ideas on the table. But I note that the four of us have a co-authored piece in the forthcoming issue of Foreign Affairs, which actually will be posted electronically this week, that goes beyond the book and articulates some ideas about the consequences for policy. So I'll stop here.
Wonderful, thank you. This week, huh?
Yeah, it might be today or tomorrow, actually.
Right. Now turn to my colleague, University Professor Michael Barnett.
Thanks. So let me just begin by echoing what Shibley said, that this was an incredible intellectual and emotional journey, and I'm glad to have gone through it with the three of them. They were terrific collaborators and partners, and spiritual guides at moments. So thank you all. But it was a difficult journey, I have to say, in that for someone like myself who's been in many ways sort of deeply involved in issues not just of the Middle East, but more specifically of Israel, this was a difficult journey to go through. It wasn't necessarily easy, and it was unlike anything really I've ever written before, because it forced me and others to actually not begin with what we hope will be or what we want to be, but rather with what is. And in many ways, as Shibley suggested, what sort of gathered us together was the subtitle of the book, What is Israel Palestine? And that's been, in many ways, as we write in the introduction, very much at the corner of so much of the history of this region between Israel and Palestine, up for question for over a century. It's never been clear. Israel's borders have never been resolute. They've always been tangential or temporary. The notion of, let's say, where Israel is became highly disputed after 1967. With different visions about where the borders are, where they should be. At the same time, Palestinian nationalists and intellectuals have offered those same sets of debates. More recently, you actually now find the recognition of a Palestinian state by as many members of the international community as Israel is recognized as a sovereign territorial state. And so these things have always been up for debate. And as the occupation, now in its 56th year, continues, it no longer seemed, the language of occupation seemed awkward and probably a misnomer. At least back in the post-World War II period, when international legal authorities began to draft doctrines of occupation, they never had in mind something like this. This was not in the cards. This was not something they imagined would happen. Occupation was supposed to be temporary, and yet here is something quite permanent, or so it seems. And I would suggest that once there are several things that actually, I think, caused us as a group to really try to reimagine what is. And part of it, I would suggest, was simply the end of a peace process that was more than a name. And I think I can speak for all four of us when I say that we thought the peace process died certainly in the early 2000s. And so if the peace process does not exist, then it leaves you with very few options in terms of what to think about what is Israel-Palestine, than to imagine that it really is based on control. And that's where it brings us to Israel. Now, as Shibley suggested, when we think about what exists there, we really begin, we actually have three analytic concepts. And I want to emphasize that being analytical in many ways helped us to escape the difficulty of having our emotions drive us. And by being analytical, we were able to start with three concepts that are quite ordinary in any beginning course in international relations or comparative politics, but which really have a kind of disruptive dimension to them when thinking about Israel-Palestine. First, as again, to sort of summarize some of what Shibley said, first is the state. And when academics talk about the state, they usually, weigh themselves on Max Weber's famous definition, which is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate means of violence. And there are reasons why or why not, or why it does not conform directly to Israel. Part of it in terms of the territories, the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, including what's the human community, which is always in some ways up for debate, and whether this is legitimate means of violence. But what it forces us to reckon with is the issue of control. And control can happen in any number of ways. Hopefully there's an element of consent, but oftentimes there's not. And when looking at that land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, one recognizes that control is consensual in some of its dimensions over some of the people, but is certainly not consensual and is coercive over others. But its state is about really that empirical aspect of control. Can it extract from its people? Does it control the land? Does it control who goes in and who goes out? Those are the fundamental dimensions of the state. Sovereignty is different than the state. There are lots of states out there that do not have sovereignty. And there are even places that have sovereignty but really do not have a state, including perhaps Palestine. But here, sovereignty is about legal recognition. It is a statement of international law, and it is to confer on another state the right to have control over and have authority over what's within its borders, and there is no authority above the state. Israel has part of that, but not all of it. Because the land that we're talking about today, which Israel claims control over, that's not legally recognized by any other state as we speak. The third dimension is probably in many ways the most, because when we think about the state, we think about the membership. Who's a member of the state? In today's parlance, we talk about citizens. But we are now talking about a state in which there are, if you will, different levels of membership. All members are Jewish Israelis. Somewhat below it are Palestinian Israelis. And then there are groups that are Palestinian, but not Israelis, those that inhabit the West Bank, Gaza. And for them, their status depends it's a sort of a pastiche of different possibilities. It depends on when you became a refugee and where you were, when you moved to the West Bank. It depends on whether you're a resident of Jerusalem or someplace else. It depends on whether you're in the West Bank or Gaza. That in many of these ways, where you are located, when you were born, and what is your ethnic or religious identity determines what rights and responsibilities you have. But to simplify things, there are just two classes of people in this new state. There are Jewish Israelis, and then there's everybody else. And if you have any doubt about it, look at the basic law from a few years ago, and look at the slew of bills that are coming down the pipe in the Knesset. It makes it clear that there are two classes of states, and then two classes of residents within Israel. And it also does something else, which Shibley also mentioned, which is that it shapes what kind of state is Israel. For the longest time, Israel was understood as a liberal democracy. That's the way it was defined by those in the West. It was never defined by those who were not full-class citizens in that way. But it was understood as a liberal democracy, and it had shared values with the West on those grounds. But Israel is either, depending on whether you think the glass is half full or not even, not even half empty, Israel has ceased to be a liberal democracy. And then you have to question, well, what kind of state is it? Well, again, as many of the bills suggest that are right now in the Israeli Knesset, Israel is a state that is built for, by, and about Israeli Jews. That's what it's about. It's about Jewish supremacy. That's a hard word to discuss, to actually evoke, but I don't think there's any way around it. This was a state that was intended to be for Jews, and it meant if it's going to be a Jewish state, then there are going to be those who are not full members. And it also means to preserve the Jewish state, means to preserve systematic discrimination against those who are non-Jews. Where does it leave us? Well, we have lots of possibilities to talk about. The one that's clearly being evoked more and more, not just by outsiders, but by Israelis, is apartheid. It may not be an exact analogy, but it's pretty close. And so, if in fact it's an apartheid state, then one has to question, as Shibley also suggested, where is it then in relationship to other kinds of states? It's a different kind of state, certainly than one likes to think about the standard liberal democracy in the West. And I think that statement poses a slew of very difficult and complex challenges, certainly for the United States. It was one thing to say, we have shared values with a liberal democracy. It's very difficult to make that same statement once you cast the frame as apartheid. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And finally, we turn to former Mesa president, but always my president, Nathan Brown.
Thank you very much for trying to be uncharacteristically brief, because a lot has been said that I'd like to repeat, beginning with Dinar's generous introduction. I'd like to repeat that word for word, but even the top words that we heard from Michael Barnett are ones that I agree with, so I won't repeat. But let me just start with one observation that goes back to something that Shibley said, and then draw some implications from that. So we got a group of people together on a subject which is famously divisive. And it's, not that everybody has agreed, but if we started with let's start with the reality on the ground. There wasn't that much debate. Yes, there is a one-state reality. And what we're trying to do is to grapple with that academically. Where it came from, we've got actually one of the contributors here, Yusuf Manayel, who gives historical glimpse, and there's some with a little bit more of a historical, a little bit more kind of operational, how this operates on the ground. But what I want to focus in my remarks is, one thing I think that is clear is, in a sense, this isn't news to the political actors in the region who have oriented themselves around this reality increasingly over the last decade. So it's not news to them. The only news is that somebody outside noticed, and now everybody's noticing. That's what is new. But in essence, I would say these are my words, not that of any particular author. You can't understand how it is or why it is that the actors behave the way that they do unless you understand that they understand themselves as living in a one-state reality. And in all kinds of ways, I think that's probably a little bit clearer on the Israeli side, right? The Israeli nationalist right has talked about this. When Menachem Begin tried to sell the Camp David Accords to the Knesset, he said point blank, at the end of the transition period, we want sovereignty over the territory, not the people. Right? So there's always been that idea. But in a sense, the one-state reality was, for some within the Israeli political spectrum, something that, it was a movement. It's like, if we don't do this, then we will have a one-state reality. Well, they don't talk so much that way anymore. It's like, we have one. But I want to mention something on the Palestinian side, because I think that's just a little bit less less accessible externally. And to me, it is absolutely striking how much it is the case that Palestinian political actors orient themselves around this, understanding it now. I mean, it's not that the Palestinian national movement has died, it's a crisis, but it hasn't died. But it's no longer, when I hear Palestinian political discussions, it's not what kind of state do we want, but what kind of strategy do we adopt. We don't know exactly where we know we don't like where we are. We know there are better possibilities out there, but we don't know exactly how to get there. Let's talk about how to make things better. One quick anecdote. This was 5 years ago. I was at a discussion. It was probably about 24 Palestinian political activists, leaders of various kinds. And I noticed something in the middle of the discussion when they talked about Palestinian political strategies, national movement, and so on, is you could draw a line at about 50 years old. The ones who are over 50, we're talking to the PLO, we've got the diplomatic process, and these were people who've been involved in it. At 50, this was like ancient history. Well, that was 5 years ago. So now you can probably draw the line at 55. And it's not that the situation is static, but that the entrenched reality of one state is something that actors understand, but it doesn't mean that nothing changes within that one state. You see, I think, an awful lot of struggle right now over precisely the contours under which that will operate. Some, in a sense, one of the big struggles in Israel right now, it has to do with attitude towards state institutions. Who do they serve? What do they serve? That's on the Israeli side. In the West Bank, you see violent conflict right now. And you also see conflict that is, I think, much less visible, except in moments of national crisis, in Israel pre-67 society based on ethnicity in mixed cities, which are now, I mean, you saw an upsurge of violence. This was, a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, spread to mixed cities, but there's a low-level conflict there that begins to look a lot less like a national conflict and much more like an intractable internal ethnic conflict within societies of people who stop speaking to each other, apartment buildings that are divided, and that's a reality that, in fact, if you listen closely to Israeli political debate, people on the far right are actually plugging into. So it's not, Shibley began by saying this wasn't necessarily a happy conclusion. I would say it's not only an unhappy conclusion, but it may be getting unhappier over the short term. But none of those who are involved are any illusions about what the situation is that we're dealing with. And we're just reporting on what they've been discovering for the last few years.
Thank you, Nathan, and thanks to all three of you. It's been quite a project to be involved in, and it's been quite interesting to see the response that it's received since coming out. I think we all anticipated quite a bit of fireworks, but in fact, it really hasn't happened because everyone now pretty much agrees with us, which was certainly not the case 5 years ago. And that, to me, is one of the most interesting puzzles, is how can you have intellectual and policy stagnation for decades and decades, followed by a very sudden and rapid intellectual and discursive change? And, I think probably the single person who's been most influential to me in thinking about these things was Ian Lustig at the University of Pennsylvania, who began writing about exactly that question about 30 years ago. And his question was always, how is it that ideas that seem like commonsensical and permanent physical facts can seem to be unchangeable and then suddenly rapidly change? Where does that change come from? And Ian has been tirelessly writing about this for decades. Most recently, he had a book out called Paradigm Lost, in which he chronicles exactly how it fell apart. I do recommend it. He's the author of the first chapter in this book, and I think that's quite telling for how he's affected all of us. I would say that we thought, as we were gathering people together and trying to think these things through, that maybe we were a little bit ahead of the curve. And we absolutely were in terms of Washington, in terms of mainstream academia. But of course, we were well behind the curve in terms of what Palestinian intellectuals were seeing, writing, and arguing about at the time. And I'd just like to call out 4 of them in particular for various reasons, because they influenced me as I was trying to figure out how to engage with this volume and with this project. One of them is in the room, Yosef Almanayer. he managed to publish an article in Foreign Affairs called "There Will Be a One-State Solution" at a time when Foreign Affairs would have, as a journal and as a representation of the foreign policy establishment of the United States, would have in the past viewed such ideas as quite toxic. It was a great article, Yusuf. Congratulations. And we're delighted to have you in the volume as well. But this certainly indicated something about the way things were changing, that these arguments, persuasive or not, were able to find an audience at the center of the policy debate. And next, I'd like to call out a friend of mine named Omar Shakir, who was the lead researcher for Human Rights Watch, where I was a board member for years, who, after an extraordinarily long and difficult research process, and after being kicked out of Israel for his research and activities, released a report calling this an apartheid-like reality. That, along with reports issued by B'Tselem, by Amnesty International, and others, I think really helped to push a cascade through the NGO community, through the international community, and to really, I think, move the goalposts on there. And Omar did an amazing job on that. I'd also like to single out Tarek Bakomi, who called us out quite forcefully and effectively by pointing out that Gaza was missing from our analysis of the one-state reality. And Tarek has been tireless in trying to analyze how to conceptualize a full one-state, which includes Gaza. And Gaza, in my opinion, is one of the locations of some of the greatest moral atrocities that we have committed. And I say we as the United States, since we've aided and abetted every step of the way, as a population has been locked in this open-air prison, routinely bombed, starved, and oppressed in every way. And for Gaza to be missing was something which Tarek forced us to engage with in a very powerful way. And then finally, Nora Erekat, down at George Mason University in Rutgers, who published a powerful book quite recently on international law and the Palestinian cause, which I think really helped me, at least, to frame these differentiations between sovereignty and statecraft that you heard from Michael and Nathan and Shibley. So not all of them are in this book, but we've engaged with all of them as we've gone along. The book itself is not just the four of us opining. It's an extremely rich set of collections. I strongly urge you to look at it. It includes both younger scholars and very established scholars talking about things they've researched for many years. Yael Berda talks about the mobility regime and citizenship regime inside of Israel. Diana Greenwald looks at the functions of the Palestinian Authority as a security contractor to Israel and how it changed and reshaped the boundaries of Palestinian political organization. Nathan and Iman Al-Banna look at changes in Palestinian political discourse. Iman was one of our wonderful graduate students here in the LA School, and so it was wonderful to see her included in the project as well. Omar Rahman and Dalia Scheinlin did a fabulous job of looking at trends in public opinion on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side. Gershon Shafir, I think, was the one who pushed us the hardest to really take seriously this concept of Jewish supremacy, which I think all of us were quite uncomfortable with at the time he was forcing us to include it in the book, and now looks quite prescient as we look at the current government of Israel and its quite explicit and open formulations of a desire to accomplish exactly that. There's many, many more, and I really do encourage you to check out the volume. I just want to say two just very, very quick things, building on things that my colleagues have said. The first is that we did not set out to advocate for a one-state solution. We're not Yusuf. Yusuf is Yusuf. We were very much looking at a one-state reality, not a one-state solution. I don't think any of us believes that one state is going to solve anything. But for decades, I've been writing at various iterations about what it means to engage in moral action as a political scientist or as a political analyst or practitioner. And one of the things that I always came back to is that it's one thing to moral grandstanding and say we must do good things and not do bad things. Fine, whatever, who cares? Have fun. As a political scientist, what needs to be done is to get the analysis right. You cannot have moral action if you have not accurately analyzed the situation as it actually exists and the likely effects of different courses of action. And I think that that's how I at least understood our project in this book, was not to advocate for solutions, but rather to get the analysis right so that others could wage their political, moral, and analytical battles on an accurate terrain rather than one, not what we wish it would be, but what actually is. And that brings me to my final point, which is that I am not an optimist on any of this. I think I might be, well, I don't know, we're all pretty pessimistic. I might be the most pessimistic. Because there's a general belief that once we've named apartheid, once we've called this what it is, that it cannot possibly survive. And I see nothing in history to suggest that that's true. Injustice can survive a tremendously long time. Once the initial impact of the apartheid label sinks in, politics moves on. Nothing necessarily changes. People can live with an extraordinary amount of hypocrisy and evil in their lives as long as it doesn't inconvenience them. And the power in the world today is not one which is leading towards greater liberalism or greater justice. The world, this is a populist age we live in which extreme ethnic, sectarian, reactionary authoritarianism is ascendant across Asia, across the Middle East, across the United States. Everywhere we see populism, reactionary, the rise of very comfortable reactionary populist authoritarianisms. And so one of my great fears of identifying the one-state reality is that by naming it, it might, rather than unmasking it and help to unravel it, it might simply be put on like a fine dinner jacket and become the new reality. And that would be quite tragic. And yet the world that we live in is one in which tragedies happen all the time. And so that brings me then to the final point, which is, I think Michael raised the most important of all the questions, is once you've analyzed this, and if you have a moral predisposition, what do you do? What policies follow from a one-state reality? We talk about the BDS campaign. We talk about framing things in terms of civil rights. We talk about changes in American foreign policy. We have our own ideas. We're happy to share them if you want. I don't know if they're good ideas. Many of you probably have other ideas, but I think that that is what we would like this book to be a launching point for, is a discussion of how does one act effectively in the face of such a reality, so that it ends up I'll put my moral priors on the table here. I would rather see a world which is more based on equality and justice than one which is not. How does one accomplish that is not obvious, because it is not the case that everybody shares those moral priors. And I'll stop with that, and we will open it up for discussion. I understood from Dean Ayer's introduction that I'm supposed to monitor online questions, but I have no ability to do so. So Diane, if you keep an eye on that and let me know, that would be great. Otherwise, we'll go to people in the room. And Matt?
Matt Levinson, I'm the director of the MIPP program at the Elliott School. I wanted to start with Mark's point that you can't take moral action unless you start with right analysis. I have long been a skeptic about the two-state solution, because I think it starts with a faulty premise, which is that if Israel and Palestine are partitioned, there will be peace and stability. And my research on conflict analysis suggests that partition often aggravates conflict rather than mitigates it. And so I think that the one-state reality may be a pessimistic future, but it may also be an optimistic future, and that would depend on whether all these people out in the streets leading this Israeli spring are open to a more inclusive vision of membership in the Israeli-Palestinian community. But that's the question. So my question is there any sign that people who are protesting for democracy in Israel are also protesting against an apartheid regime?
Good question. Chris.
Hi, I'm Joey. I actually graduated from the Middle East Studies program, so it's nice to be back. I'm currently at Georgetown Security Studies program. And I have not read the volume yet, admittedly, but it seems like an incredibly detailed description of what is happening in Israel. I was wondering though, does the volume give a similar analysis to the reality of what's happening within Palestinian society? Particularly, a couple of you mentioned the Mediterranean to the Jordan River and talking about the West Bank and Gaza, and in terms of consent of being controlled on behalf of Palestinians, does the volume grapple with issues such as do Palestinians give consent to the Palestinian government to be controlled? What is the difference between how Palestinians are treated by their respective governments in Gaza versus in the West Bank? And I was just wondering, where does that analysis of the realities of Palestinian society play into the discourse of how do we match that with the realities of how Israel treats Palestinians as well?
Great, thank you. We have one from
reading on behalf of Jonathan Lindenbaum, who is Elliott Class of 2021. Question for Professor Mark Lynch. I'm glad you brought up Lustig, as his book influenced me very heavily. Also shout out to Peter Baynard, who's been branded a traitor for being similarly ahead of the curve. Would love to hear you speak more about what opposed two states foreign relations landscape looks like, especially with regards to the US-Israel relationship. I mean, we have Biden invoking two states as recently as last December, for example.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Folks in the back.
Hi, my name is Sabrina Soffer, and I'm a sophomore here majoring in philosophy. And so I'll just go into my question. So you guys discussed working with a one-state reality and Israel's inability to maintain a liberal democracy. I just also want to mention that just 2 days ago, there were 3 British Israelis murdered only for being Jewish, and there have been 19 terrorist attacks against Jews in 2023 thus far. And these include non-Jews or non-Israelis, like American and Italian tourists as well. And these attacks also hurt Arabs and other minorities who live in Israel. So my question is, how would you secure Jewish survival and democracy in the Middle East, given the terrorist threats to Jews from all sides and to non-Jews as well, when autocratic regimes like Iran can band together with Palestinian nationalists in Israel? And where would democracy and security go then?
Thanks, Sabrina. Oh, right next.
Hi, I'm Arthi. I'm a junior at the Elliott School. I was wondering what this acknowledgement of the one-state reality would, what kind of implications this would have for Palestinian leadership, as well as terrorist groups based in Palestine, and what kind of security threats could emerge from that with a mainstream acceptance of the one-state reality. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthi. You can just throw it. We'll catch it.
Hi, my name is Ben. I'm a student here in Elliott School, Masters in International Affairs. And I was wondering what you see the role of the international Jewish community being in the future. You know, successive Netanyahu administrations have pushed back the pro-Israel anti-occupation Jews globally. And you know, do you think that this one-state reality will end up seeing a change in the diaspora community that might pressure Israel?
Okay, thank you. Why don't we go here? And then there, I think we have to answer.
I am a senior student at school. I'm wondering how the various existing theories and concept of ethnic conflict, civil war would like plays out in the context of one-state reality, like concepts of ethnic security dilemma and concepts like the rational theory of ethnic war. Yeah, like how the political science concepts play out with one-state reality.
Wonderful, thank you. And then last question over here. Oh.
Hi, my name is Allison. I'm a senior here. So you made it very clear that there's a significant lag between political science here in Washington and political discourse on the ground in the areas we're studying. My question is, how do we go about fixing this?
Okay, wait. Okay, we'll go here, and then Avi, and then we'll answer.
And then we'll be done with an hour.
Hi, my name is Vic Soffer. I'd like to understand your definition of apartheid. I mean, it seems to me that this word gets thrown around, and if your definition of apartheid in Israel is, equating to the definition of apartheid of what was back in South Africa. I'd like to understand what your view is.
Hello, I'm a student at the Elliott School of Middle East Studies. I have a question for Professor Barnett, please. You talk about apartheid and Jewish supremacy. Maybe it's true, but my question is, did you touch in the book that almost every poll of the Palestinian society that living within the 67 border, almost every poll proved that they saying that even in the case that will be a two-state solution, they will still not give up on their Israeli citizenship.
Wonderful. Why don't we go one by one? I mean, I think it's fairly obvious to me which questions would go to whom. I mean, Nathan wrote the chapter on Palestinian institutions, and Michael wrote about the American Jewish community. Shibley, why don't you go first, though?
Okay, let me start with the first question, actually, about sort of the Israeli demonstrations. You know, there's no question that they're mostly focused on judicial reform in a sense of threat to the Israeli democracy within the 1967 borders. I mean, there's no question that is what's animated all of this. Now, there are a lot of, it's not that Israelis, particularly liberals and the few progressives on the far left have not been tying the Israeli democracy with what's happening on the West Bank. There were a few voices who have said, if you don't end the occupation, it's going to come back into Israel. This is, and you see that a few voices also speaking that way. But by and large, even the liberals in Israel, what people have termed the Tel Aviv bubble, have lived in their world and pretended as if the West Bank and Gaza are really not next door. And I think by and large, that's what motivated these demonstrations. Now, the reality, though, is that now as they come to grips with it, I think it's going to have some political and sociological impact. I do. And the reason for it is the following. If you look at who are these liberals, they're actually the ones who, while they might be a minority in numbers in Israel now, they're actually the ones who control much of the power in the state. It's not the disempowered people who are actually demonstrating. These are the people who are the bankers and the financial, the high-tech, sector, and the educated university professors. And so we're talking about the people who are really, those are the ones who tend to be more liberal. They're the ones who are out there. So they have a voice that typically is much bigger. That's why the economy is sort of paralyzed during this. Or not quite paralyzed, but it has impacted the economy for sure. Certainly some sectors of the economy. Now, if you look at their numbers, though, if they want to go by the rules of democracy, even within the pre-1967 Israel, there is absolutely no way, not even a shred of a chance, to prevail without the Arab citizens of Israel. Even in that area, there's no way. I mean, you either make you either enter a coalition, or you're just going to lose. It's the overwhelming majority of Jewish Israelis right now on the right. That's just the only reason why it's even close is that you have Arab citizens who elected some members in the Knesset. Took this out, and you don't have a chance. So that's going to change a different kind of the conversation because I think it's going to hit, and it is hitting already. The question is, what do Palestinian citizens of Israel want? As was mentioned earlier, their view was not very different from the common view, which is that they want full equality inside, but they want an end to the occupation, and they accepted the idea of two states. In fact, the Arab parties in the Israeli Knesset have, by and large, supported the idea of two states. Still, the paradigm that prevails is one of two states. Will this shift even their view? That's something to watch. I'm not not 100% sure about that, but one thing I want to say, I want to pick up one more question, which is related to this gap between policy and scholarship. I mean, it's interesting. George Washington, an intellectual, is right next door to the State Department, and obviously I don't think that's what they're talking about next door. So what is this? You know, I as somebody who's participated in policy, both with Republican administration, Democratic administration, including on this very issue that I've advised government on. So I come at it as a scholar who's been engaged in policy, and I know both worlds. And it isn't, the policymakers are not as detached as we assume they are. I know a number of high-level people in government who have said it's too late for two states, and they're advocating two states in public, because that's where they're not going to take that on. They're not going to change the paradigm. It's too costly. It's not a high priority issue. No one is going to lead from within. And so the reality of it is that, yes, there isn't, the paradigm may not change from the inside until it changes on the outside. And then it catches. So you have to think about it not necessarily as the interactive, you know, that they're missing the boat, they don't really know what they're doing. It's more about priorities, the political environment of which we are a part, right, in terms of our discourse. And you have to think about it that way, because we have to think about our, and this is a project to change the thinking, and then it'll catch up to policymakers.
I think Shibley, Michael?
Yeah.
And by the way, we started like 10 minutes later, so we're all going in now.
That's good to know. Okay. Those are terrific questions. And, you know, the temptation, of course, is to try to, you know, address so many of them. But I think there are a few that I feel, you know, demand at least my attention. The first is about this definition of apartheid. And I don't know if it's, I felt, at least in the group, that I was least hesitant to use that term. And not only because I wasn't sure that it applied, but also because I was worried about, you know, I guess scaring people off our argument, because apartheid had been such a taboo language to talk about with respect to Israel that, you know, people get harassed for using it. But at the end of the day, I'll tell you, know, apartheid is a legal language. Apartheid is about international law, and it is about systematic discrimination by one group of another group based on any number of considerations, but largely around, as is now colloquially understood, largely around race, but not only on race, but largely around race. I think we can say, at least I feel comfortable saying, that discrimination in Israel is systematic, but it's not just about race, although you will hear some on the Israeli right talk about Arabs and Palestinians as of a different race, which is actually kind of a new language to have emerged over the last 10 years. Yet, I think we, you know, for those who have supported Israel, let's just recognize up front, it was created in 1948 as a state for the Jews. It was supposed to be a Jewish state. If that's going to mean anything, there has to be then laws that help to support a Jewish state. That's, I think, quite matter of fact. And we know since 48 that Arab Israelis, now Palestinian Israelis, were systematically discriminated against. That, I think, is undisputable. And then when you widen that to include the so-called territories, now I think we want to say former territories because they're now part of Israel, is to say that discrimination is simply about Jews against others. And that, as we see today, and as this current Knesset hopes, it will become further institutionalized, in which Jews have more rights than non-Jews. And it's designed to maintain Jewish power. I don't think that's controversial. I don't think that it may be difficult to hear it in those terms, but it is about Jewish supremacy. I don't see any other, you can't call it a liberal democracy. I don't think there's any other way to describe it. Now, you might want to find and this is part of the argument we had, a more organic language to Israel. Call it something else then if you want, but acknowledge that whatever you call it, it has to include practices of discrimination by Jews against non-Jews. That's, I think, undebatable. Now, the other question I just quickly answer is one about the diaspora. Israelis really don't give a lot of thought to the Jewish diaspora. Okay, historically, they are second-class citizens. Okay, if they were real Jews, they'd move to Israel. That's kind of language. Real Jews move to Israel. Second-class Jews stay outside. And so largely Israeli Jews have had a very dismissive attitude towards diaspora Jews. That continues. They're supposed to be the silent partner that keeps on supporting Israel unconditionally. That's changing. It's been changing for several decades now, but you find, Jewish American community really quite splintered. You have some that continue to support Israel, but are actually finding it more difficult to do so. You're finding those who are increasingly taking more oppositional views, like J Street, and then you find a great number of Jewish Americans who are becoming indifferent, who actually don't want anything to do with it anymore. And the consequence then is, I think that, those in the Jewish diaspora can, complain all they want. I don't think it's going to move the needle much in Israel. You might say, well, how can you claim to be a Jewish state if you don't have the support of local Jewry? I don't think Israel will care. I think they're tone deaf on these issues. But I do think that the language of apartheid, and here we've had some conversation about that, is that it is a reframing. It is to say, this is an apartheid state, and you just can't go on as normal once you say it's apartheid. I think we kind of learned that with South Africa. And so as a consequence, things are going to change globally, I suggest, and not just as we see for where Israel's position, but to follow on Shibley's remarks, it's also that this creates an economic instability, as we've seen within Israel. I have so many Israeli friends who are now applying for passports elsewhere, who want an exit option. There's now those in the high-tech sector who are thinking about moving their holdings to another country. What happens when those who produce the gold decide to leave? I think that creates a very different dynamic also for the future of the state.
Can I add just one more thing, if I don't mind, and particularly with the use of the term supremacy, which I don't think it's essential. I think you could look at it as gradation of labeling, privilege to supremacy to possibly even exclusivity. I'll give you an example. I think that let's say the Israelis are not controlling the West Bank and Gaza and 5 million Palestinians. Let's say it's really pre-1967 Israel. What you would have is a Jewish state that is a flawed democracy, but nonetheless a democracy. That I think Arab citizens are not fully equal, but they have they have most of the rights of the Jews, not all. They're discriminated against structurally, but not any worse than many other places around the world. And that's why people, kind of were comfortable calling it democracy. And I think that because even the Arabs themselves, as pointed out, wanted to have more and more of the democracy, but they understood the limits. So that's a situation where you're looking at it through that prism. Once you open it up and look at the residents and including the 5 million Palestinians part of the state, then it's a completely different relationship that you have to define, because it doesn't only pertain to those 20% of citizens, but also the others. And then you have to evaluate that situation accordingly. So in the first, the question of privilege, that has always been there. from the beginning, as you know, Michael pointed out, it's defined as a Jewish state. There've always been discrimination, structural discrimination, and worse against Palestinians. And in some ways, at some point, it improved for Arab citizens of Israel. At another point, it started declining again. But if you look at public opinion polls among Jewish Israelis, like take the 2015 Pew poll, that was a very large poll, thousands of people among Israelis. 79% of Jewish Israelis, including a majority of liberal Israelis, secular Israelis, actually, that's the way it's defined, said that Jews should have privilege over non-Jews in Israel. That's you know, an overwhelming majority of Jewish Israelis expected in a Jewish state. But 48% also said they supported expelling Palestinians from Israel. So that's another extreme end. So you have basically, if you look at it through a kind of a scale, you have Jewish privilege, you have Jewish supremacy that has emerged with the far right particularly, and you have people who are calling for Jewish exclusivity on the other end of this scale. That, you know, it's sort of like deportations or expulsions. So I think you have to look at it as a dynamic scale, but beginning from the beginning in terms of how it was defined, but it was kind of evolved into more and more and more supremacy, for sure.
Nathan? Okay, we've gone over your 10 minutes, so I'll try to do this in 1 minute. There's a lot of questions, we just can't answer a lot of questions. So let me just close with just two very quick observations. First, there were several questions about Palestinian politics, and then since Matt's there about the two-state solution. This is an edited book, so there's not one single argument, but if I were to say there's a mentality behind the analysis here, the foil, the unspoken foil is me, in the sense that 20 years ago, I wrote a book on Palestinian politics, which says, let's take Palestine as a political system and understand it in its own terms. And this book basically is informed by mentality that says, no, wait a second, this is part of a one-state reality. So there are Palestinian political structures, there are Palestinian political actors, there are Palestinian inhabitants of this territory, but we have to understand this, you know, as it's a system of control, mobility, and so on. You mentioned, somebody mentioned Alberta's chapter, Greenwald's, and so on. So that's kind of the general approach of the volume. There were other questions about political violence, terrorism, that sort of thing. And I'm just happy to talk afterwards if anybody wants to. But because of the time, I'll just say one thing. Up here, you've got 3 international relations scholars. The first, I'm comparative politics, but the first Middle East course I took was called International Relations in the Middle East. And there's certainly international dimensions to this that have been on display over the last week. But what we're looking at, I think, is a conflict that has metastasized into a bitter internal conflict. And the kinds of violence that people have been referring to is what's going to characterize it. If I go back to when I first started studying the Middle East, what were we kind of worried about? American-Soviet nuclear confrontation. Now it's what people are doing to each other on the ground in the ugliest ways possible. And so it's a different kind of conflict. And I hate to end on that note, but that is a kind of conflict that I think, as Mark said, unlike a nuclear conflict, it can drag on and on and remain unpressed.
Great, thanks, David. And I'll just very briefly try to pick up a few of the questions that are still outstanding, just very, very quickly. On the question of the Palestinian terrorism, violence on the ground, I think that, yes, and it's probably going to get worse. I think it's likely to escalate, take on new forms, and it's likely to continue to take a toll as long as we don't find some way of creating some kind of just and inclusive society within this one-state reality. Palestinians are getting killed on a daily basis. Their homes are being dispossessed. There's, kind of increasing and ever-escalating incursions on their lives, and every death is tragic. And especially tragic when it is so clearly being driven by things which could be addressed at a political level and so clearly are not. And so what does this do to the U.S. Israeli relationship, Jonathan's question from online. I think generally speaking, and this also goes to the question about the disconnect between Washington and the academy. And here, I think there's much less of a disconnect than you might think. The Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israeli-Palestinian Affairs was here at the Elliott School last week. And he knows all of these things, but, and I would say that everybody in the White House knows all of these things. They all know these things. But they don't act on them for various other reasons, because of political considerations, because of structural constraints, and that sort of thing. I don't think that this is a knowledge issue. I do not think that people who spend their lives studying every aspect of microscopic level of the political developments on the ground are unaware of the one-state reality. It's more the sense of paralysis and impossibility of finding anything else, hence the clinging to the possibility of a two-state solution in order to avoid having to come up with something different. And I think that's why I think there's more stasis in the policy debate than there is in the academic and kind of civil society debate right now. Go back to Nathan's thing about the Palestinians above and below the age of 50. President, I think he's a wonderful man. He's 78 years old or 79, something like that. He clearly falls on one end of that under and over 50 spectrum. I'm borderline. I'm not going to say. But all I'm going to say, though, is that there's real generational change happening. And I think that what we're seeing is that the walls that hold all this in place are rapidly crumbling, in part because of demographic change. In the Middle East, you're talking about societies where the vast majority of the population are under the age of 30, and they have no memory of anything other than what is right now, and no fealty to fantasies of a two-state solution. I want to end with the Arthy's question about what does this mean for the Palestinian leadership. I think the Palestinian leadership that currently exists is a function of this one-state reality. They basically exist at this point only to provide security for Israel, and eventually they will, I mean, it doesn't seem likely, but eventually Abu Mazen will die. I mean, it might be a long time, but eventually he will fade from the scene and new leadership will emerge. And that leadership, if it is going to be representative and effective within Palestinian society, the sort of thing that might actually be able to lead Palestinians to move towards political inclusion and participation, then it's not going to look anything like the current Palestinian Authority, which I think has largely run its course. But with that, we have also largely run our course. I'd like to thank you all for coming. Great questions that everybody asked. Thank you, Dean Ayers, for the introduction. And I'm sure that many of us would be happy to continue chatting after the event. But I will simply, oh, Michael, you said one. You want to say one last thing?
Yes, I'm sorry. I forget the last word. I just want to comment on some of the questions that had to do about the nature of the violence. And I think it was your question in the back that I think stood out for me, which was that the tendency then to see Israeli violence, because it's done by a sovereign state, as legitimate, and any violence committed by Palestinians as illegitimate. And I just want to go back to 2 points. One is there is the language of state-based terrorism. And a lot of violence committed by the IDF and others does strike me as within that notion of state-based terrorism that has been circulating for decades. So just because it's done by Israel doesn't make it legitimate. The second is that, and this is more radical, but it goes back to earlier statements in international law about the right of a people to resist. There's sometimes resistance that is terrorism, but there's other forms of resistance that are not necessarily terrorism, that are actually within, and this was written as part of the decolonization movement, where it is legitimate for a people under occupation to resist. Some of it will be violent, and if the violence is at conscripted forces, for instance, and not as civilians, then it does count potentially as legitimate. And I think that as we move into this one-state reality, we have to also rethink that nature of violence.
I'm afraid I can't let Michael have the last word, should we?
No, I just want to say, obviously we all have different opinions on this. It's not out of the books that we're putting out. But, you know, to me, I think the question is not, I mean, violence is inevitable when you have a situation of this sort. And it's not that we ought to oppose violence under any circumstance, particularly against civilians, no matter who conducts it. But here's the thing. So when we say one state reality, what we were saying as well is that this doesn't mean that the international community is going to recognize Israel's sovereignty of that reality. And we're not calling for that at all. So the objective position for the international community is not likely to change on the legality of what Israel does and does not do, even if it considers its relationship with the Palestinians in the context of an apartheid-type relationship. That is, can Israel build settlement on the West Bank? Not under international law. The international community isn't suddenly going to recognize Israeli sovereignty on the West Bank, and building settlements is still going to be opposed by the international community. It doesn't shift that game at all. That comes out of our separation, the idea of state versus sovereignty. And here's the thing about the violence that we all want to see diminish. Of course, we want to see the whole structure shift. Think about what that means for the international community. How, aren't you taking away the peaceful mean of people to resist when you're preventing a UN resolution and Security Council from holding Israel accountable when it's violating the international law, such as in building settlements, as the administration has done. So for those policymakers who aim to reduce violence, they certainly shouldn't be taking away the most effective peaceful means available to the international community, such as international organizations and UN